The Sopranos is a crime drama which follows the life of New Jersey mob boss Tony Soprano and his relationship with his children, his wife, rival mob families, and his own crew. One of the most fascinating relationships in the series is Tony and his connection with Christopher Moltisanti, the deuteragonist of the series and Tony's nephew. Well, technically he isn't exactly his nephew, but Christopher is deeply loved by Tony and is essentially his protege, with Tony grooming the young mobster, moulding him to become his number two or maybe even the next boss after Tony's reign. Christopher is fascinated by Tony, reveres him, honours him, he loves him like a brother-in-law. He looks up to him as a son would do to a father, not least because Christopher's own dad died when he was young. Tony states that his relationship to Christopher is similar to Tony's own relationship with Dickie Moltisanti, Christopher's father, who was a mentor to Tony, and by the time I release this video, The Many Saints of Newark, the prequel movie to The Sopranos, is out now, and has surely revealed some further interesting aspects to the dynamic between Tony and Dickie. Anyway, Christopher is something of a disappointment to Tony. He constantly fails when tested or when opportunities arise for him to prove himself. He's a constant source of irritation for Tony, as many of his immature and unwise antics cause trouble for the family, such as when he talks out of turn in a meeting with New York crime boss Johnny Sack, causing Sack to become infuriated after Tony specifically told him to watch his mouth at the meeting. Christopher gives Tony's daughter Meadow speed in season 1 behind Tony's back. He shoots up Tony's car and drunkenly enters the Bing, brandishing a gun after he suspects Tony of sleeping with his girlfriend. His loyalty to mob life is questioned when he decides to pursue a career in acting or screenwriting, and he constantly disobeys Tony's orders and advice. The list of stupid, irresponsible, and inappropriate acts on Christopher's CV are endless, and even still, the higher he is on drugs, the higher he rises up and up in rank, obviously due to the nepotism shown to him by Tony, which does not go unnoticed by other mobsters and causes dysentery in the ranks. There is no greater trait of Christopher that undermines him and his relationship with Tony than his drug and alcohol addiction. Like his father before him, Chrissy succumbs to the temptation of the drink and is constantly using and abusing drugs such as speed and even heroin. At one point, Christopher is given an intervention, at which the likes of Silvio, Paulie and Benny Fazio, the criminal mastermind, are present, and he is even forced to go into rehab after his addictions spiral out of control. By the way, did anyone notice the foreshadowing with Tony saying at the intervention, "I ought to suffocate you"? We all know that the other guys in Tony's crew would not be given a trip to rehab and an intervention if they had similar issues. It'd be a quick bullet to the back of the head. But Christopher does eventually gain control over his desires, the jokes and off-colour remarks from other mobsters at his expense notwithstanding, and albeit with the occasional slip here and there. Christopher proves his loyalty to Tony by telling his boss that Adriana has been speaking to the feds after she confesses to him. Rather than go into witness protection and live the life of a schmuck, he gives her up, allows her to be murdered, and continues his life as Tony's would-be successor. However, even though eventually he is promoted to the position of capo, Christopher never receives the respect he has so desired throughout the show's run. When Tony Blundetto, Tony Soprano's cousin, returns from prison, Christopher gets jealous at the two's relationship, which often involves them poking fun at him for his addictions and abstaining from alcohol. Even after Tony B is long gone, Christopher and Tony Soprano never quite have the relationship they once did, what with Chrissy's constant fuck-ups, and instead it's Bobby Bacala, Tony's new brother-in-law, who becomes close to Tony, both professionally and personally, at the expense of Christopher. Christopher marries Kelly Lombardo after learning that she's pregnant with his child, and they eventually have a daughter. We never really learn much about this woman. Most Sopranos fans probably don't even remember her name, but that's the point. Christopher and Adriana genuinely did love each other. They had a long-lasting and deep relationship, and this new woman is essentially Christopher going through the motions and playing his part by getting married to your average Italian-American woman. Christopher is resentful to Tony, not least because of the whole Adriana affair, with him considering himself to have undergone a tremendous sacrifice for Tony. But in spite of this, the two continue to drift apart, and Christopher unloads some of his frustrations with J.T. Dolan, a screenwriter and Christopher's acquaintance from rehab, who Christopher then murders in cold blood. Later in the episode, Kennedy and Heidi, Christopher drives Tony back from a meeting with the Shah of Iran, jamming away to the soundtrack from The Departed, specifically Comfortably Numb, which is an apt choice as it deals with the lifelessness feeling of being on drugs, and as Tony suspects, Christopher is under the influence while driving, and this leads to them crashing off the road, with Christopher being seriously injured. He wasn't wearing a seatbelt, whereas Tony was, and he coughs up blood and pleads with Tony to help him because he won't be able to pass a drugs test, revealing to Tony after everything that has happened, after all that was done for Christopher and all that the duo have gone through together, Christopher was once again on drugs. The show makes a point to highlight the baby seat in the back with a branch through it, a branch which just as easily could have impaled Christopher's daughter instead, and after initially dialing 911, Tony instead suffocates Chris by pinching his natural canopy of a nose until he dies. It is not clear whether Christopher would have survived had Tony not done this, but it is later mentioned in the show that the doctor said he could have made it, but he didn't. Nobody ever finds out that Tony was the one who killed Christopher. It's something known only by the man himself, with Christopher being added to quite a lengthy list of close associates who Tony has had killed, along with Tony B and Pussy. So why exactly did Tony kill Christopher? The reasons are pretty obvious, and I'll get to them, but in this video I wanted to analyze things a bit further, to go a bit deeper into the relationship between Christopher and Tony, and come to a comprehensive conclusion as to why killing Christopher was an essential part of Tony's growth, one that sealed his transformation into the man he became, a transformation which you could argue started with his killing of his close friend Pussy many seasons ago. Before we continue, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already done so and hitting the notification button so you don't miss out on future videos. You can also support the channel on Patreon or by becoming a member, where you can get perks such as early access and exclusive videos. So when Tony looks over to the baby seat and then makes the decision to kill Christopher, he's come to the realization of something that he probably always knew in the back of his head, and something that many fans of the show, myself included, thought about Chris. The man is a stone-cold liability. He's messed up so many times, from small things like coming late to meetings to colossal ones such as his drug addiction. Chrissy being addicted to drugs and selling them means he could land a hefty prison sentence, which could persuade him to turn rat and cooperate with the feds, giving Tony up, with whom his relationship is already fractured as it is. Tony knows this. He's known it for a long time. Junior even told him years ago that when a dog gets rabies, you put it down. His advice, the advice of a man whom he respects and seeks wisdom from, is to kill Christopher, and yet for whatever notion, probably because of his love for the man, Tony ignores this advice. Truth be told, Christopher probably should have been killed all the way back in season 1. The only reason he lasted as long as he did, as we all know, is because he's Tony's nephew. But here the penny drops. Christopher's addiction has been going on for so long and has come so far that now it has even endangered his life, Tony Soprano, boss of New Jersey. Chrissy almost made AJ and Meadow fatherless, Carmela without a husband, and after nearly killing his own boss because he can't control his addictions, he has the cheek to say to Tony he needs to help him out of there because he's going to lose his license? Maybe that would have worked with season 1 Tony, but by season 6 Tony has become a monster. He has fully embraced his narcissism and his selfish and sociopathic tendencies. He is, to all extent and purposes, the main villain of the show, unjustly killing those who he despises like Ralph, or those who threaten his power like Junior's capos. There's a level of hypocrisy and irony with Chrissy's relapses, because Tony is in part responsible for this. He laughs along with the rest of the crew when Paulie jokes about Christopher's daughter working at the Bing. He alienates Christopher when he remains neutral after Paulie targets Christopher's father-in-law's business. And when you grill Chrissy for his drunkenness and drug addiction, but then chastise him and joke about his abstinence, what's the poor guy supposed to do? What do you want? You can't have it both ways. Tony's decision to kill Christopher, it can be argued, was also for Christopher's own good. He's a liability to himself as much as anyone, and what if one day Chris's issues cause the death of his wife and kid, or he ends up having to do decades in the can? He has to be killed, for his own sake. At least, that's probably what Tony tells himself to make himself feel better about the situation. And if you've come away from the scene thinking that Tony killed Christopher out of some righteous reasoning about Christopher being his own worst enemy, you've missed a significant development of Tony's character over the course of the show. And that is that by the time season 6 rolls around, he only cares about himself. Sure, there is love for his children and Carmela, but that's where the line is drawn, and everyone else is simply a tool, a puppet for Tony's own machinations, much like any random whore at the Bing. Tony kills Chris because it's convenient for him for Chris not to be around anymore, and he justifies it to himself with the baby seat. All of Chris's problems and sacrifices, they meant nothing to Tony in the end, and he seized on this opportunity and got rid of a big stone in his shoe. Tony only cares about himself, and so all of that stuff about Christopher essentially killing himself is just Tony covering his sin. It's the way he justifies what he did. When he phones Carmela when he's in the hospital, he immediately tells her that Chris wasn't wearing a seatbelt. He mentions the baby seat about 4 times during Christopher's wake for no reason. He makes fun of Chrissy's mother while she mourns him. People are consoling Tony everywhere, and yet he seems mildly annoyed and bored by it all. Even Paulie was genuinely distraught at Christopher's death, and yet Tony has become such a sociopath that he is numb, even slyly implying to others that maybe it's a good thing that Christopher isn't around anymore. He even suggests to Carmela that she's relieved that Christopher is dead, much to her disgust, and this is clear projection on Tony's part, and the entire crux of the issue. Tony is happy that Christopher has died, and no one else shares this sentiment. The people that Tony thought might also be happy, like Paulie, are beside themselves with grief, showing you just how far Tony has gone off the deep end, that a sociopathic murderer like Paulie comes off as a warmer human being. At one point during the funeral, Tony laments that he can't take this, and is bemused to find Carmine Jr. patting him, telling him we're here for you, who clearly misunderstood what Tony meant. The only time that Tony actually comes clean is when he tells Dr. Melfi in a dream that he's relieved, unloading everything, saying, you know what, this is bullshit. I haven't been able to tell anyone this. I'm fucking relieved. A weak, fucking, snivelling, lying drug addict. The biggest blunder of my career is now gone. And he comes close to essentially saying the same thing to Melfi in real life. It's worth mentioning that he ceases to refer to Christopher as his nephew or say that he was like a son, instead telling Melfi in the dream that Christopher was a friend, in inverted commas. He talks as if Chris was just another associate, not that he was a son-like figure, who Tony himself brought into the mob and taught him his ways. Things come full circle with the murder of Christopher, the killing of what is essentially his own son, his own kin, the original sin perhaps, which propels Tony into becoming what he was always going to end up as, a fully fledged narcissist who wants to be perceived as the victim. In other words, his mother, the woman he so despised and wanted to be nothing like. This is hinted at throughout the show. There's even entire lines of dialogue that Tony shares with Olivia, such as when he says to AJ, "Oh, poor you." There was a time where killing someone close to him, like Pussy, emotionally destroyed Tony, but not anymore. Not with what he's become. Now he's so delighted he even goes on to fuck Christopher's ex-girlfriend and take drugs. Ironically, the same thing he criticizes Chris for doing. There is also heavy emphasis on the theme of father and sons, with Dickie being a father figure to Tony, and Tony of course being one to Chris. Christopher puts music from The Departed on, and this is a film about a crime boss played by Jack Nicholson who wants a son but is unable to have one, and he instead has Matt Damon's character who is essentially a protege and a surrogate son. I talk more about the father and son themes of The Departed in a video of mine called Was Colin Gay, but the irony of that film is that Jack is killed by his would-be son. Sticking with the father-son theme, Tony's mind wanders to Uncle Junior during the car ride, who was also a father figure to Tony, playing catch with him during his youth, and yet he also tried to put out a hit on Tony, and later actually shot him, almost killing him. And now Tony, in that position of a father, killed his own son. Tony is an intelligent man, and perhaps on some level he felt guilty about Christopher's situation, knowing he created it, and after looking at the back seat, knowing that Christopher will go on to pass his dysfunctional nature onto his progeny. Tony's worst fear is passing off his toxic nature and psychological issues to his children, but he's already done this, just not to his blood child. Tony is Frankenstein in this case, and Christopher is his monster. And on a subconscious level he knows it is his duty to put an end to the misery of his monster, himself and others around them. Not the most mainstream of interpretations I know, but one I think is just as legitimate. So why do you think that Christopher, after all the doer had went through, decided to kill Christopher? Let me know in the comments below, subscribe to the channel, and thanks for watching.